I used to think peace was the sound of my garden at 7 in the morning before the birds grew noisy and the town began its daily hum. That hush, that faint breathing of the world, felt like companionship. My tea would steam on the porch railing. The roses would glisten faintly with dew. And the only footsteps I expected to hear were my own. When you live alone for as long as I have, your house becomes a kind of body every creak, every draft, every scent part of your pulse. I had grown used to the stillness, even protective of it. My daughter Ruth called it a mausoleum of habits. I prefer a well-trained silence. Across the hedge lived Arthur Pembrooke, retired teacher, widower, with an impeccable lawn and a fondness for cardigans. We had a gentle friendship born of proximity and shared endurance to old neighbors orbiting the same patch of earth. He brought me tomatoes in summer. I baked him scones in winter. Nothing dramatic ever passed between us, which I suppose was the charm. He had a particular kindness about him, steady, measured, the sort that made you feel seen without being exposed. Sometimes he'd sit on his porch and hum to himself, old jazz standards I half remembered from youth. There was safety in his predictability. The world outside might unravel, but Arthur would still be there pruning his roses and waving from behind his fence. One Thursday, in early October, the air began to carry that crisp promise of winter. I was pruning my dahlias when I heard Arthur call my name. His voice had a tremor I'd never heard before, like something fragile in it had cracked. When I turned, he was standing on his walkway, clutching a small metal box to his chest. It looked heavy, though not large, about the size of a dictionary, gray and dull with age. His face was pale, his shirt wrinkled. Arthur was not the sort to appear disheveled. "Eleanor," he said, almost whispering, "I need a favor." Just for a little while, there's a tone people use when asking for help that makes refusal impossible. Not because of the words, but because you can hear the fear beneath them. He stepped closer, glancing up and down the empty street. "My grandson Theo is coming to stay. Lovely boy, but reckless. Wild temper. He's been in a bit of trouble." Arthur swallowed hard. "There are some private things, old papers, keepsakes I'd rather he didn't stumble across. Could you keep this for me? Just for a week or two." He extended the box toward me. Was cold against my palms, heavier than I expected. A simple brass lock hung from the clasp, scratched and dull. "Course," I said, though something about it unsettled me. "Is it valuable?" "No." Sentimental. His eyes darted toward the hedge, then back to mine. "Please, Eleanor, you've always been trustworthy." That word, trustworthy, landed softly but deeply. I nodded, feeling the strange gravity of the object in my hands. When he left, I set the box on the dining room table, meaning to tuck it away in a closet. Yet as the day wore on, I found my eyes drifting back to it. The lock looked old, flimsy. I told myself I wasn't curious, only concerned. What if it held something dangerous? A gun. Medicine. Secrets have a way of poisoning the air around them, even when unopened. By evening, I was pacing. I made tea, sat down, stood again. The box waited, silent and reproachful. There's a point in loneliness where the mind begins to invent company. Mine often took the form of moral debates with myself. That night, my conscience was divided cleanly in two. The librarian who respected privacy, and the aging woman who couldn't stop wondering what her neighbor feared his grandson might find. I fetched a small screwdriver from the drawer. The lock surrendered to easily one twist, a faint click. Inside was not what I expected. No papers, no valuables, only a folded, faded scarf stained a deep brownish red. A black and white photograph of a young woman smiling in mid-laughter. A tarnished silver locket, and at the bottom, a single sheet of yellowed paper. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. The ink had bled in places, but the first line was clear enough to stop my breath. I, Arthur Pembrooke, on the night of October 17th, 1984, took the life of Lily Reed. The rest blurred before my eyes. The clock ticked once, twice, before the world seemed to regain motion. Outside, the wind rattled the hedge. Inside, my tea had gone cold. Somewhere in the quiet house, I could almost hear Arthur's gentle hum drifting from memory, soft, familiar, and suddenly unbearable. For a long while, I just sat there staring at the words, my pulse thudding in my ears like a slow drumbeat. I told myself it had to be a mistake, a story Arthur had written, some dark piece of fiction. The handwriting, though, was unmistakable. I'd seen it before on the labels of his marmalade jars and the birthday cards he signed with careful flourish. Your old neighbor. Arthur P. The confession continued in trembling script. We argued by the river. She said she'd leave me, tell the police about the money. I didn't mean to, but she fell. I panicked. I couldn't think. I buried her near the old willow. Every day since, I've wanted to undo that night. But there's no undoing blood. The words swam in front of me. I folded the paper, slid it back into the box, and shut the lid. For a moment, I thought I might be sick. The first instinct of an old woman alone is not heroism, it's survival. I locked my doors, turned off the porch light, and sat in the dark living room with my hands pressed together as though in prayer. The house seemed to listen. Arthur Pembrooke, murderer. The man who once brought me chrysanthemums when my cat died, who carried my groceries when my hip ached. Impossible. Yet the proof sat 10 feet away on my dining table, radiating dread. Sleep didn't come that night. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw the young woman's smile from the photograph. She had one of those faces that seem mid-laughter live, unguarded. Her hair was tied with a scarf that might have been the very one folded in that box. The stain, now that I thought about it, had the unmistakable pattern of a splash darker in the center, feathered at the edge. By morning, sunlight spilled through the curtains, too bright, too innocent. I brewed coffee strong enough to taste like punishment and stared at the box once more. If the confession were true, someone must have noticed her absence. A family, friends, perhaps even a headline. I turned on my computer and typed the name Lily Reed, 1984. The results came like a slap. The second link down was an old newspaper archive. Local woman missing after argument by river police continue search. Her photo matched the one in the box. The article mentioned that her boyfriend at the time, a young teacher named Arthur P., had been questioned but released. No body ever found. The case had gone cold by 1986. My breath left me in a shudder. I leaned back from the screen, suddenly aware of the faint smell of dust and old paper, like the scent that clings to library archives. My own hands were shaking. That afternoon, Arthur appeared in his garden as usual, trimming the hedge with that meticulous precision of his. From my kitchen window, he looked utterly unchanged, calm, tidy, humming under his breath. He saw me watching and waved with his pruning shears. I managed a stiff nod. My stomach lurched. How do you look at a man who might have buried a woman and then spent 40 years watering petunias over the memory? I tried to go about my day as if nothing had happened. I even baked an apple tart, though the smell turned my stomach. Yet every small sound, the knock of the oven door, the clink of the knife against the counter, made me flinch. That night, I reread the confession. I told myself it might still be a fantasy, a punishment he'd written for himself, maybe for something lesser, some youthful shame. People carry strange guilt as they age. I'd seen that often at the library, where old men borrowed books about crimes they never committed, just to feel less alone in their regrets. Still, the details were too precise: the date, the location, the name. Each line of the letter was a wound that refused to scab over. I dreamed that night of a willow tree bending over black water, its branches brushing against the current like fingers searching for something lost. When I woke, the dawn light looked gray and heavy, as if the world itself had aged overnight. Days passed, each one a rehearsal of normal life. I waved to Arthur from the porch, spoke lightly about the weather. He seemed relieved that I acted as usual, which only deepened my dread. Did he sense my knowledge? Could he read it on my face, the way a fox can scent fear? On the fourth evening, I saw him standing on his porch long after dark, staring toward my house. He didn't move, didn't wave, just watched. I turned off my lights and stood behind the curtain, heart hammering. The next morning, I carried the box to my sewing room and tucked it behind a row of old fabric bolts in the closet. Then I sat down, folded my hands, and tried to remember the sound of his voice before it began to sound like a lie. What unsettled me most was Auntie. The thought that Arthur might be a killer was the dawning suspicion that part of me already knew. There had always been a quiet sorrow in him, a loneliness too specific to name. Now it had a name. The morning after I hid the box, my house felt smaller. The rooms seemed to lean inward, listening. I brewed tea, but even the kettle's whistles sounded accusatory. Every object carried a faint tension, as though the world itself were holding its breath. I told myself to let it go, to call Arthur, give the box back, and forget I'd ever pried it open. Yet each time I imagined handing it to him, I saw the line of his handwriting 9 took the life of Lily Reed. The thought of touching that box again made my skin crawl. The thought of not touching it, of leaving it in my closet like a sleeping animal, was somehow worse. By mid-afternoon, I found myself in front of the computer again. It felt childish, like sneaking a peek into a diary, but curiosity is a tyrant once it's been fed. The internet is a strange place for ghosts. Lily's name lived there in fragments, scanned articles, missing person boards, a faded yearbook photo. One podcast episode caught my eye. The River Willow Mystery, episode 14. The host's voice was young, earnest. Lily Reed was 26 when she vanished. Last seen arguing with her boyfriend, Arthur Pembrooke, a local teacher. The sound of my neighbor's name spoken aloud by a stranger made the back of my neck prickle. No charges were filed. Police believed Lily drowned accidentally, but her body was never recovered. I paused it there. The silence that followed felt louder than the voice had. That evening, I walked to my mailbox at dusk. The air smelled faintly of burning leaves. Arthur stood by his hedge pruning roses in the dim light. He looked up and smiled. "Evening, Eleanor?" I forced a smile back. "Lovely weather." "Yes," he said. Eyes calm, too calm. "Autumn's honest, isn't it? Everything dying right in front of you." I mumbled something about dinner and hurried inside. Behind the curtain, I watched him clip the final rose, then stand there a moment too long, shears hanging loose in his hand. Over the next few days, I started gathering pieces of Lily's story, the way a magpie collects shiny things. The librarian in me couldn't resist. I printed articles, scribbled notes in the margins. Lily had been a dancer once, teaching classes at the community hall. She had a mother still alive when the case went cold. Mrs. Reed, now surely long gone. Every new detail made Lily more real, and Arthur more impossible to reconcile with the man next door. Yet the strange part was how similar they seemed in old photos. Both of them bright-eyed, confident, full of the sort of energy that burns out too soon. Maybe what frightened me most, that I could still see the echo of that young man in the stooped figure tending his hedge. I told myself I'd stop digging after one more article, then another. Curiosity became routine. Celt became background noise. I was a librarian again, only this time the archive was made of people's tragedies instead of catalog cards. One afternoon, I drove to the local library downtown, the one I used to work in before retirement. It felt strange stepping back into that world of quiet aisles and humming fluorescent lights. The young librarian recognized me and smiled politely, unaware that I was there to exhume a ghost. The microfiche machine still worked. I scrolled through reels of old newspapers until I found it. October 18th, 1984. The headline, "Search continues for missing dancer." A quote from Lily's mother caught my eye. "Arthur loved her. I can't believe he'd hurt her. But he hasn't helped find her either." I read that line over and over until it blurred. Love, guilt, silence, the unholy trinity that keeps people bound for decades. As I left the library, the sun was low and golden, casting long bars of light across the parking lot. I saw my reflection in the glass door, an old woman clutching a folder of clippings, her face pinched with secrets. For a fleeting second, I didn't recognize myself. When I pulled into my driveway, Arthur was there again, sweeping his porch. He waved, but there was a pause before the smile reached his eyes. "You've been out," he said conversationally, leaning on his broom. "Yes," I replied, my voice thinner than I intended. "Library errands." "Ah," his gaze flicked briefly toward my passenger seat, where the folder lay half visible. "Still keeping busy." Something in his tone made the air turn cold. I went inside, locked the door, and pressed my back against it, listening to the faint scrape of his broom on the pavement. That night, the podcast episode continued to echo in my head. No body was ever found. The sentence had the rhythm of a heartbeat. At some point after midnight, I got up, opened my sewing room closet, and stared at the hidden box. It sat there quietly, as if aware I'd betrayed it by seeking outside confirmation. I reached in, touched the metal. It was icy, almost wet with condensation. A silly detail, but it sent a chill through me. The box felt alive, patient. I whispered into the dark, "What are you doing to me, Arthur?" There was, of course, no reply. Only the tick of the hallway clock, counting down the distance between curiosity and fear. The next week unspooled like a reel of film left too close to the fire, moments warped. Colors distorted, edges curling in on themselves. The routines I once cherished began to feel like stage directions I was obliged to perform. Wake at 7, feed the sparrows, water the azaleas. Pretend that the man next door hadn't confessed to murder 40 years ago. Yet the more I pretended, the louder the truth hummed beneath the surface. It started with small things. Arthur's greetings became a little too deliberate, his smiles a fraction too practiced. He still brought over tomatoes, but now they sat on my counter untouched until they softened and leaked their sweetness into the bowl. The scent of overripe fruit filled the kitchen, sickly and cloying. I couldn't bear to throw them out. It felt like discarding evidence. One morning, I heard the rattle of my mailbox and stepped outside to find Arthur lowering the lid. He looked up, startled, as though caught mid-trespass. "Just dropping the neighborhood newsletter," he said lightly. His politeness sounded rehearsed, every syllable ironed smooth. That afternoon, I decided to visit the river, the one mentioned in the confession. It was only an hour's drive north, near the old willow mentioned in the letter. I told myself it was morbid curiosity, but really it was need. I needed to see whether such a place could exist outside of ink and memory. The river turned out narrower than I imagined, winding through a corridor of reeds and silver-leafed trees. The willow stood exactly where he'd said it would, its branches swaying like threads of seaweed in the breeze. Beneath it, the soil dipped toward the water, damp and uneven. I knelt and pressed my fingers into the mud. It was cold, almost slick, and for one dizzy moment I thought I saw the faint outline of a hollow. I wasn't looking for bonsai. Told myself that repeatedly, but for truth, or whatever remains of truth after 4 decades of silence. When I got home, the sun had already slid behind the roofs. Arthur was waiting on his porch, pipe in hand, smoke curling around his face. He waved. I lifted my hand, careful to keep my expression blank. "You've been out again?" he called across the hedge. "Yes," I said, "a little drive." His eyes, half hidden by shadows, seemed to linger too long. "Good to get fresh air," he replied. "At our age, stillness can be dangerous." That night, I couldn't eat. I sat by the window with a blanket around my shoulders and stared at his lit windows, wondering what he did when no one was watching. Did he reread that letter in his head? Did he picture the riverbank the way I had that afternoon? A sudden pang of pity pierced me. What if he truly had been haunted all these years? What if the box was not a confession meant for others, but a form of self-punishment, a way to trap the guilt where he could see it? The human heart, I've learned, is a courtroom with no clear verdict. 2 days later, I went to the community archives and asked to see any follow-up reports on Lily Reed's disappearance. The clerk, a bored young man with a coffee stain on his tie, led me to a file cabinet that looked older than both of us. Inside, I found photocopies of witness statements. One stood out. A neighbor reported hearing raised voices around 10 p.m. near the river. The male voice was described as educated, possibly older. Educated, possibly older. It could describe anyone, yet it fit Arthur too neatly to ignore. Another note, scrawled by the original detective, mentioned inconsistencies in Pembroke's timeline, but added that he had a strong alibi from colleagues at the school dance. Colleagues who, I realized, would have wanted to believe the best of him. Driving home, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. Eyes sharp, mouth drawn tight. I hardly recognized the woman staring back. She looked like someone preparing for battle, not gardening. That evening, Arthur came by with a basket of pears. "The tree's done well this year," he said. "Share them with me." The gesture might once have touched me, okay? Now it felt like an intrusion. Still, refusing would raise suspicion. So I invited him in. We sat at my kitchen table. The clock ticked with excruciating clarity. He studied the wallpaper, the photographs, the faint smell of cinnamon from the candle I'd lit to mask my nerves. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "you seem troubled lately. Are you all right?" The question was gentle, but I felt the trap beneath it. "I'm fine," I lied. "Just restless. You know how autumn makes one reflective?" He nodded slowly. "Yes, reflection can be dangerous too. Some memories are better left asleep." For a fraction of a second, our eyes met and held. Behind his mild expression, I saw something flicker wariness, maybe, or warning. After he left, I scrubbed the table until the wood lost its sheen. My hands shook. The smell of pears clung to the rag, sweet and nauseating. Later that night, I placed the box on my desk and opened it again. The scarf lay there like a wound. I lifted the locket. It was cold, heavier than it looked. Inside was a photograph of Lily and Arthur together, his arm around her waist, both smiling. The intimacy of it made me shudder. A thought occurred to me, unwelcome but insistent. Perhaps he'd wanted me to find it. Perhaps entrusting me with the box was a kind of confession by proxy, plea for someone else to carry the weight. If that was true, then the burden was now mine, and it was crushing. Sleep refused to come. Around midnight, I wandered the garden. The air was sharp, the grass wet with dew. In the distance, a dog barked once and went silent. Across the hedge, Arthur's house was dark except for the faint orange glow of his study lamp. I imagined him inside, writing letters, maybe another confession, or simply staring at the same photograph I had just held. For a moment, compassion returned, unexpected and painful. People are rarely monsters, I thought. They are accidents waiting for witnesses. Then the light in his study went out, and the darkness folded neatly back around us both. I went inside, locked the door, and whispered to the empty room, "What do you want from me, Arthur?" The box sitting on the desk gave no answer, but the silence felt thick enough to choke on. It began with a knock. Not a timid tap, nor the friendly rhythm Arthur always used, but 3 slow, deliberate raps that seemed to echo through the hallway long after he'd stopped. I froze at the kitchen sink, my hands still damp from washing the breakfast dishes. The morning light cut across the floor in pale stripes, and in that light the air itself seemed to pause. I opened the door a few inches. Arthur stood there, hat in hand, his smile a fraction too wide. "Eleanor," he said, his voice to calm, "do you still have that little box I gave you?" "I think I'll take it back now." There it was, no preamble, no warmth. The sentence fell like a stone between us. My throat felt dry. "Oh," I managed. "Yes, of course. But I'll have to find where I put it." "You said you didn't want Theo too. He's gone," Arthur interrupted gently. "Went back home yesterday. You can give it to me now." He smiled again, but this time the corners of his eyes didn't move. The expression felt carved in place, like something worn for too long. I lied without thinking. I tucked it somewhere safe, but my memory isn't what it used to be. "I'll look this afternoon." For a moment, he just looked at me truly. Looked tanned, I felt my skin prickle. There was an understanding in his eyes, quiet but unmistakable. He knew. Of course, he said finally, stepping back. No hurry. Just let me know when you find it. When the door closed, my knees gave out. I sank to the floor and stayed there, listening to my heartbeat roar in my ears. That afternoon, I watched from the window as he pottered about his garden, trimming, sweeping, glancing toward my house every few minutes. Always humming, always pretending. The air between our homes had thickened into something almost visible. I spent the rest of the day rehearsing explanations. I opened it by accident. I was worried about you. I didn't read much. Every version sounded hollow. He would see the truth in my face before I could even speak. That night, the phone rang once, then twice. When I answered, silence. Arthur, I said, my voice trembling. The line clicked. After that, I unplugged the phone. Sleep was a stranger. I sat up reading the confession again, tracing the loops of his handwriting. The ending was a plea. If this ever comes to light, let it be known I did not mean it. I have lived every day as punishment enough. The words should have softened me, but instead they filled me with a kind of fury. Remorse without restitution is vanity, nothing more. I thought of Lily's mother, how she must have waited year after year for answers that never came. I thought of the flowers Arthur left at my gate every spring, the careful manners, the endless small talk. All those years I'd thought he was kind. Now I saw it differently. He'd been performing penance and using friendship as his camouflage. 2 mornings later, he came again. This time, I didn't open the door. His voice floated through the wood, steady but taut. Eleanor, he said, I've been thinking. That box, perhaps I should come in and help you look for it. I wouldn't want you straining yourself. My heart thudded. Not now, I called back, forcing calm. The house is a mess. He chuckled softly. You've always been tidy, Eleanor. I doubt that. I heard the faint creak of his shoes on the porch boards. He was leaning closer now, speaking through the gap near the hinges. I do hope you didn't open it, he murmured almost kindly. It wouldn't do either of us any good. The words were light, conversational, but my blood went cold. Then silence. The shuffle of retreating steps, the click of his gate latch. I stayed there for a long time, one hand still pressed to the door. The house had never felt so fragile. Every shadow seemed to move. Even the tick of the clock sounded like footsteps. The next day, I called the local police. I didn't give my name. I said only that I had information about the Lily Reed case. That evidence existed that the killer still lived quietly in our town. The officer on the line sounded skeptical, maybe even amused. Ma'am, he said, that's a 40-year-old file. You'd have to come in, make a statement, provide proof. Proof, the word cut like glass. I hung up without answering. Proof was in my sewing closet. Proof might kill me. Later, at twilight, I saw Arthur standing at his window, watching my house. No pretense now. His figure was still, his face unreadable in the orange glow of the setting sun. When I turned away, my reflection in the glass startled me. My eyes looked wild, hunted. By the 3rd day, he stopped waving. He only watched. A letter arrived that week, slipped under my door instead of through the mail slot. The handwriting hissed. My stomach dropped. I unfolded it carefully. Dear Eleanor, I believe we've come to a misunderstanding. That box was never meant to burden you. I know curiosity can be tempting. Let us speak plainly as friends. Bring it to me tomorrow evening. I'll make us tea and we can clear the air. Arthur. The script was elegant, but the final word, Arthur, looked darker, pressed harder into the paper as if the pen had trembled with restrained anger. I burned the letter in the sink. The paper curled inward, blackened, then vanished. The smell lingered, sharp and bitter. That night I decided I couldn't face him alone anymore. I searched the internet for the cold case detective mentioned in one of the podcasts. Detective Luis Reyes, retired, but living in the next county. He'd left his contact email for ongoing leads. My hand shook as I typed. Ha! I have something connected to the Lily Reed case. It's in writing. Please, help me. I hesitated, then hit send. Afterward, I sat at the window, staring out at the hedge between our houses. The moonlight caught the silver of his garden shears, resting on the fence. They glinted like teeth. I remember whispering into the dark, "He knows I know." A gust of wind rattled the gate, and somewhere far off, a dog barked again. The night pressed close around the house, thick and watchful. By morning, the email had a reply. Detective Reyes wanted to meet in person, discreetly. He said my message contained details only the perpetrator could know. He would come that afternoon. I read it twice, my heart swelling with relief and dread in equal measure. Because at that exact moment, a shadow fell across the window. Arthur, standing at the hedge again, smiling faintly, holding his gardening gloves. He lifted a hand in greeting. I smiled back mechanically. By evening, one of us would be free. Detective Reyes was due at 4. By noon, the sky had already gone that grayish white that presses on a person's temples, the kind of weather that makes every sound seem muffled, secretive. I spent the hours before his arrival pacing from room to room, pretending to tidy. In truth, I was arranging the house the way one arranges their conscience-moving things, so that guilt and fear might look like order. The box sat on the table, wrapped in a shawl as though modesty could disguise murder. I had decided not to hide it again. I wanted it visible, waiting. I wanted a witness. At 2:30, I heard the familiar shuffle of Arthur's shoes on my porch. The knock came softly, almost apologetic, like an afterthought. "Eleanor," he called through the door. "You never stopped by yesterday. I was worried." I didn't answer. "May I come in for a moment?" The words were warm, the tone gentle, but the air behind them carried something metallic. I forced my voice to stay steady. "I'm resting, Arthur." A pause. "Resting." He gave a small, humorless laugh. "You always were so conscientious." "I admire that." Then quieter, closer to the wood, "You have the box near you, don't you?" My pulse thudded. I backed away, my slippers whispering against the floorboards. He must have sensed the retreat. "Eleanor," he said again, softer now, "I was foolish to burden you. It's not what you think. It's just something I keep to remind myself." We all have our penances. I could picture him there, his hand resting against the doorframe, the mask slipping. Grief and calculation mingling in the same expression. "I'll leave you be," he said finally. "Perhaps later we can talk about what you found." The last sentence hung in the air like a noose. When his footsteps faded, I bolted the latch and sat on the floor, shaking. Every creak in the house felt alive. At 4:15, a knock sounded again, 3 brisk taps. My heart leaped. I peered through the peephole. A man in his 50s stood on the porch, trench coat dusted with drizzle, a thin badge wallet in his hand. "Mrs. Wells, Detective Reyes." Relief came so fast it hurt. I opened the door. He stepped inside, taking in the tidy parlor, the lace curtains, the box on the table. His eyes were sharp but kind, the sort of gaze used to measuring grief. "May I?" he asked, nodding toward the shawl-wrapped bundle. I unwrapped it slowly. The metal gleamed dully in the afternoon light. Reyes opened the lid, careful, methodical. His expression changed almost imperceptibly as he saw the contents. The scarf, the photograph, the letter. "You've read it." My voice cracked. My voice cracked. "I shouldn't have, but I'm glad you did." He studied the paper a moment longer, then folded it with deliberate precision. "This could close a case I've carried my whole career." I sank into a chair. "He's next door." "He knows I know." Reyes looked up sharply. "Now, always," I whispered. Before he could speak again, another knock rattled the door. Not gentle this time. Reyes motioned for silence. "Eleanor." Arthur's voice again, cheerful on the surface. "I thought perhaps we could have that tea after all." The detective's eyes met mine. He gave a single nod. "Let me handle it." He opened the door halfway. "Mr. Pembroke." Arthur froze, then offered that smooth teacher smile. "Oh, I didn't realize Eleanor had company. I'm Detective Reyes," he said evenly. "May we talk?" Arthur's gaze flicked from Reyes to me and back again. The smile faltered. "Course, but perhaps not here." "Eleanor shouldn't be troubled. I think she's been troubled quite enough," Reyes replied. The two men stood facing each other in my doorway, living and the haunted. For a moment, no one moved. Rain began to patter against the porch roof, soft as breath. Arthur sighed almost theatrically and stepped inside. "Then let's end this farce, shall we?" He looked smaller than I remembered, his cardigan soaked dark at the shoulders. His eyes, once mild, had the glassy sheen of exhaustion. "You found it, then," he said to me, nodding toward the box. "I suppose I should thank you for keeping it safe." Reyes's voice was calm but firm. "Mr. Pembroke, we can discuss the details downtown. You'll have an opportunity to explain." Arthur didn't answer immediately. He walked to the table, fingers brushing the photograph. "She was laughing when I took this," he murmured. "We'd planned to leave town, start over." It was raining that night, too. He turned to me, his expression oddly tender. "I didn't mean to hurt her. I only wanted her to stay." Reyes approached carefully. "Then you'll want to make that clear in your statement." Arthur nodded slowly, then looked around the room, the teacups on the counter, the clock ticking above the mantel. "I thought I'd buried it deep enough," he said. "But guilt grows roots." When Reyes gently took his arm, Arthur didn't resist. He only looked at me once more. "You've done what I couldn't, Eleanor," he said quietly. "You let the truth breathe." As they stepped out into the drizzle, I followed to the porch. The sky had deepened to the color of wet slate. The detective guided him toward the unmarked car at the curb. Arthur moved with the hesitant grace of a man twice arrested, once by the law, once by his conscience. Before ducking into the back seat, he turned. "Tell the garden I'm sorry," he said, almost smiling. Then the door closed. The car rolled away, taillights smearing red through the mist. I stood there until the street was empty, until the only sound left was the whisper of rain on the roses he detended so faithfully. The relief that came was strange, not joy, not triumph, but a hollow quiet, as though something immense had just exhaled. Inside, the house felt different, lighter, but fragile, like a shell left after the creature's gone. The box sat open on the table, its contents damp from the air. I folded the letter, placed it back inside, and closed the lid for the final time. Outside, thunder muttered over the hills. I whispered into the noise, "It's done." Only then did I realize my hands were trembling, not from fear this time, but from the shock of release. The night after Arthur's arrest, the world seemed to hold its breath. The rain had stopped, but the air was damp and heavy, carrying the faint smell of wet soil and something else like regret left too long in the air. Detective Reyes had asked me to come to the station for a statement. I told him I was too tired. He understood, but his voice held a note of something unspoken. "If you'll want to hear what he says," he'd told me, "it's been asking for you." I didn't go that night, sat by the window instead, staring at the dark shape of Arthur's house. The lights were off. The garden he loved so much looked like a graveyard in the dim streetlight. Somewhere beyond those walls, the ghosts he'd carried for 40 years were stirring. Around midnight, my phone rang. It was Reyes. "Mrs. Wells," he said quietly. "He's talking. You should know he doesn't want a lawyer. He says he's finished hiding." For a moment, I couldn't speak. "What's he saying?" Reyes hesitated. "He's telling it like a confession. Not to me, to you. It's strange, like he's narrating to someone who isn't there." I closed my eyes. Of course he was. He'd lived behind the walls of guilt so long that the only person who could hear him now was the one who'd torn those walls down. The next morning, I found myself walking to the police station without even deciding to. My body simply carried me there, through the mist and the quiet streets, as though following the pull of something inevitable. Inside, everything smelled of coffee and disinfectant. A young officer led me to a narrow hallway lined with holding rooms. Behind one of the glass partitions sat Arthur. He looked older, collapsed somehow. His cardigan had been replaced with a standard gray sweatshirt, and yet he still sat with the same careful posture, hands folded as though waiting for tea to be poured. He looked up when he saw me. No surprise, no anger. It's just the faintest trace of relief. "Eleanor," he said, his voice muffled through the glass. "I hoped you'd come. I didn't sit." "Detective Reyes said you wanted to talk." He nodded slowly. "Not talk. Tell you deserve to know the rest." Reyes stood nearby, arms crossed, watching silently. Arthur leaned forward, his palms flat on the table. "I met Lily Reed in 1984. I was 32. She worked at the post office mart, impatient, with that laugh that made you feel you'd missed the punchline. I wasn't married yet. We were foolish, both of us. We talked about leaving town, starting fresh. Then one night, she said she was tired of hiding, tired of the secrecy. She wanted to tell her fiancé everything." He paused, eyes closing. "We argued. She ran. I caught her by the riverbank. It was raining so hard I could barely see. Just wanted to stop her, make her listen." His voice trembled. She slipped. The rock hit her head. There was blood everywhere. I didn't plan it. God, I didn't. He pressed his fists to his eyes. "I tried to call for help, but the river was rising. I panicked. I thought if they think it was me, my life's over. So I buried her by the old oak. I told myself it would just be until the storm passed. But the storm never ended. Reyes' expression didn't change, though I saw his jaw tighten. Arthur went on. I joined every church committee, planted every flower, brought soup to every widow. I built a life made of good deeds like bricks over a grave. But it never worked. She followed me everywhere. Her laugh in the wind. Her reflection in puddles. Even the roses, she hated roses. Said they were too proud, so I grew them anyway, as punishment." He looked directly at me now, his eyes bright with something like fever. "When I gave you that box, I thought maybe if someone else carried it a while, I could breathe. You were kind, trustworthy. I thought I could share the weight without explaining it. I didn't mean for you to open it. I felt tears prick my eyes. Arthur, you killed her." "Yes," he said it softly like a prayer, "and every day since. 40 years of small deaths, silence pooled between us." The hum of the fluorescent light overhead filled the space where words should have been. "Finally," he said, "when you found the letter, I knew it was over. You looked at me the way she did that night, like you saw everything. I suppose that's what freedom feels like, doesn't it?" Being seen, he sat back, exhaling slowly. "Tell the detective I'm ready to sign whatever he needs. I've already written a statement. I ask that you get a copy if you want it." He smiled faintly. "You've set me free, Eleanor." Then, quieter, almost to himself. "For 40 years, I was the one buried in that shallow grave. By the time I left the station, dawn had broken, pale and uncertain. The world looked freshly washed, though nothing felt clean. Reporters swarmed the story before nightfall. Local man confesses to 1984 murder. The town reeled, torn between disbelief and fascination. To most of them, Arthur had been a gentle widower, the man who pruned the roses by the churchyard. To me, he'd been both more and less a man who had built a life out of regret and almost fooled himself into goodness. When Reyes called that evening, his voice was subdued. "He's not fighting it," he said. "It's cooperating completely. It's rare, Mrs. Wells. It's like he wanted to be caught." "He did," I whispered. "He just didn't know how to ask." After we hung up, I sat alone in the quiet house. The garden outside was slick with dew, the flowers bending under their own weight. Roses, those proud, beautiful things, still bloomed by the fence. They looked almost defiant, as if life itself refused to apologize. I picked up the box from where I'd left it on the mantel. It felt lighter now, empty of secrets, maybe. Or maybe the weight had simply shifted from his soul to mine. As I traced the dents in its lid, I thought of Lily, her laugh, her unfinished life. I thought of Arthur, who had spent 4 decades trying to make peace with a ghost and failed. That's when I realized something chilling. Had been right. In a way, guilt does grow roots. okay? And when it does, it winds its way into everything you touch. Even the kindest hands can hide the darkest soil. I set the box down and opened the window. The night air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of earth and rain. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed and faded. For the first time in weeks, I breathed deeply, without trembling. It was 3 weeks before I received his letter. The envelope came by hand. Not Detective Reyes brought it himself, hat in hand, his expression unreadable. "He wanted you to have this," he said simply, placing the envelope on my table. "He's gone." Gone. The word clung to the air like fog. Reyes nodded. "Heart failure. 2 days after sentencing. Peaceful," the nurse said. "He didn't fight it." I stared at the envelope. The handwriting was unmistakable, precise, deliberate, old-fashioned. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded twice. The ink had bled slightly, as if written with an unsteady hand. It read, "Dear Eleanor, thank you for setting me free. For 40 years, I was the one buried in that shallow grave. Tell Lily's spirit she can stop haunting the garden. Tell her the roses are hers now. With whatever's left of my gratitude, Arthur." That was all. No pleas, no excuses. Just the strange grace of a man who had waited half a lifetime to say goodbye. I folded the letter back into its envelope and sat there, listening to the clock tick. The sound felt louder than usual, as though time itself were clearing its throat. Outside, the garden swayed in the wind. Arthur's roses were still thriving deep crimson, lush, alive. I'd thought of cutting them down after everything, but somehow I couldn't bring myself to. The truth was, they'd been his apology to the world long before his confession. Now, they were his epitaph. That evening, I brewed a pot of tea and carried my cup to the porch. The air smelled of damp soil and fading summer. For the first time, I didn't feel afraid to look at his house. It sat quiet and empty, its windows dark, the blinds drawn. Yet it no longer seemed sinister, just hollow. When night came fully, I walked into the garden, my shawl trailing in the dew. I knelt by the roses and pressed my hand to the soil. The earth was soft, almost warm. "Arthur," I whispered, "you were right about guilt. It does grow roots. But so does forgiveness." I stayed there a long time, watching the moon rise over the hedge. The petals gleamed like wet silk. Somewhere nearby, a cricket began its steady rhythm, life continuing, indifferent and relentless. A week later, a reporter called. They wanted an interview for the human angle of the case, the elderly neighbor who helped solve a 40-year-old murder. "You're a local hero," the young man said brightly. I declined. Heroes don't tremble when the wind rattles the shutters. Heroes don't wake at night, hearing the scrape of a trowel and wonder if it's guilt digging itself back up. Instead, I kept my small routines. Morning tea, crossword. The hum of the radio in the kitchen. Occasionally, Reyes stopped by to check in. He'd sit on the porch steps, sipping coffee, while we spoke of nothing important. Never asked about the box, and I never told him what I'd done with it. 'Cause one morning before dawn, I took it to the garden. I buried it beneath the rosa scarf, photograph, letter, everything. The soil closed over it easily, as though it had been waiting. I placed a single stone over the spot, small and smooth. No inscription, no name. When I finished, I sat back and waited for the sun. The sky lightened slowly, the horizon blushing pale gold. The first light touched the roses, and for a fleeting second, they looked almost aflame. That was the moment I realized the truth, the kind that only comes when the noise of the world has finally gone still. Evil isn't born from cruelty alone. Sometimes it grows out of silence, out of politeness, out of the small lies we tell ourselves to keep our hands clean. Arthur's life had been built on one terrible silence. My own, I think, had been built on many smaller ones. That morning, I decided to speak differently, to live differently. To call my sister, whom I hadn't spoken to in years. To visit the nursing home where I'd once feared I'd end up alone. To plant something that wasn't born of guilt. Now, when I walked through my garden, I talked to the roses. not out of madness, but remembrance. I tell them about the neighbor's new baby, about the storms that came and went, about how the world keeps turning as it must. Sometimes, when the wind passes through just right, I could swear I hear two voices in the rustle of the leaves hers, and his no longer bound by regret, just part of the air that feeds the flowers. And when I look up at the house next door, I no longer see the shadow of a murderer. I see a man who buried his heart long ago and, in the end, let it be found. The roses still bloom each year, wild and defiant. Their roots drink from old sorrow, and somehow what grows from it is beautiful. Perhaps that is justice, not vengeance, not punishment, but truth allowed to take root and bloom again. I tend the roses every morning, pruning, watering, whispering small thank yous. They answer only with silence, but not the kind that hides, it's the kind that heals. And in that silence, I find peace.